Doctor, Flip and Constance Clarke are back in the brand new Doctor Who Big Finish main range release in The Behemoth. It's finally the start to the 6th Doctor trilogy once again for 2017. A lovely way to end off the year for me of reviewing many Doctors. We finally get to the end to have some more good old 60 adventures, and this one is an incredibly good one to start off on because we've got the 6th Doctor, we've got the wonderful companions, and then just to add to that to make it even more exciting, we've got a pure historical, which just in case you haven't seen my previous review of Time in Office, we all know at the very end of that, I got rather excited because I love pure historical stories and I of course adore the 6th Doctor, so this is pretty much the perfect bond for me when it comes to Doctor Who 1. I did have very high hopes and then I found out who it's written by, and then my hopes escalated even more as this episode is written by Marc Platt. For those of you that don't know, he's the one that wrote that really good Cyberman story from Big Finish that everybody who listens to Big Finish whines on about, called Spare Parts, go-to story for Big Finish. He also written The Silver Turk as well, so yeah, he's got a very decent profile when it comes to Doctor Who. A rather high expectations release for me. So first off, and as always, in the description below, I will leave the link to go and buy this release from the Big Finish website. It's currently out now for $14.99 for the physical CD and $12.99 for the download as well. This episode, of course, is written by Marc Platt and is directed by Jamie Anderson, and the cast for this one is pretty decent, to be honest. So to start off with, we have the 6th Doctor, played by Colin Baker, and yeah, he wasn't really very good for this one. I don't really like the 6th Doctor very much. Of course I do. He is absolutely brilliant in this story. Once again, he had some really good moments. I think that the 6th Doctor has a really good pairing with that classical feel and really well adjust to different scenarios. I think especially the way that in this story, and nicely dressed up in all different period of clothing. So yeah, I think that he's very good for this story. Rather comical in parts and rather serious as well. I think that he's the great balance between the two. And once again for this one, it's just your standard 6th Doctor. Colin plays him absolutely wonderfully. I think that even though it's been many years since he last ever appeared in the TV show, it's in fact recently been 30 years, I think that he can still reprise that role really well. I think that he takes great pride in being the Doctor, and I think that his Doctor has had so many different variations over the years. You've got that serious 6th Doctor, the comical 6th Doctor, and we've got the very loving 6th Doctor in there as well, and then you have a little bit of the aspect of the Valeyard in there as well. And I think that with this 6th Doctor for this story, as I say, we have a little bit of a mix between the two, the comical and the seriousness at the same time, adjusting to serious human situations. We have Lisa Greenwood as Philippa Jackson, or Flip Jackson, or whatever you would like to call her. She's in fact a recent addition to the TARDIS team once again. After her having a few stories with the 6th Doctor a few years back, they kind of met at the end of Quicksilver last year, and that was very exciting to see them all coming together. And I think that this story is once again, Flip is just an absolutely wonderful character. It just is so modern, and it's wonderful to see the 6th Doctor, a classic Doctor, paired with somebody that is very modern, knows how modern teenagers just generally work. I think that Flip is a really wonderful character because she is getting on older. I think that she's probably late teens, something like that, because she's married by now. I don't know, she may have got married at a younger age, I don't particularly know, but yeah, a great breath of fresh air into the show, especially when compared to the other companion and the Doctor himself as well. I think that the serious side of the 6th Doctor, compared to a very funny, sort of rather adventurous companion, is just wonderful. And then the comparison between Flip and Constance Clarke as well, who I may as well come on to now. Anderson's Constance Clarke, or she refers to her as Connie Clarke, but yeah, I think that she is, I think that Constance Clarke is one of those characters, once again, comparing her to Flip, they are from incredibly different backdrops, and that makes for a really interesting bond. I think that not necessarily that they don't like each other, but considering that this is still a very early stage in the relationship, I think it is quite clear that they do care about each other. She's a historic companion, she's from Bletchley Park in World War II, she's came from that very different backdrop, she has very different customs of different things and how they work, and then Flip, as I say, is very modern, and those two things paired together, they don't exactly work, but they do at the same time, and that allows for different ideas. And when we're introduced to certain scenarios, we do have different responses to that because of the two different companions and the way that they are. Really going to go into any of the other characters for this review. I just think that generally the cast was very strong. I think that they represented that period very well. I think that this episode is a very big eye-opener, especially when it comes to Doctor Who. Firstly, what is this episode called? It's called Behemoth, which apparently, on a little bit of Googling, I shall get the quote and definition up now, a behemoth is a huge monstrous creature, because in this episode we do have a giant rhinoceros called Lady Clara, and a little bit of Googling on that as well, and it turns out that Lady Clara did in fact exist. It is a rhino that went around Europe and different parts of the world, touring as something that just people to basically just stare at and go, isn't that wonderful? It's a rhino, how exciting, because most of them have probably never seen a rhino before in their lives. So it's very nice to see for this one. With it being a pure historical, you do expect it to sort of follow facts, and I think that this one is a very good example of that. It's pairing up with something that isn't exactly mysterious, and just making it feel a lot more real. And I would like to get on to the main idea for this one solely now, because I think it is a very good premise. Of course, Marc Platt for this one has gone on with the slave trade, and that is of course a very dark period of human history, as we all know. We've probably all studied it in school, and yeah, I think the episode really well sums it up, because we've heard a lot of the slave trade from the American perspective and the way that we had slaves in America. This episode does something a little bit different, and we in fact have Bath in 1756, so it is a very English-based story, which I know that a lot of people do think that when it comes to Doctor Who, we do need to sort of branch out into different countries, and I do agree with that. It would be really nice to see maybe a little bit in the Vietnam War, or China in its past, or Russia in its past. That would probably be an incredibly dark story, but yeah, I think that we've had a few of them that does in fact ring a bell. But I think that with this one, it does have that aspect of the British idea, the British focus, and the way that that part of history was reflected in Britain. However, at the same time, I do really like that, because I think that this topic, as I say, is very based around America and the American slave trade, and this is the English take on that. And judging by what I've said, you can already tell this one is a dark period story. It's a story that reflects a very dark period of human history, and this episode does reflect that incredibly well. If you're somebody that doesn't like bleak episodes of Doctor Who and is all about that sort of new series fairy tale-esque story that we see in the 11th Doctor era, this episode is not for you. This episode is quite gritty, it's quite personal, it's quite sort of life-affecting as well. I think that the characters in this one definitely do have their lives affected, because we do get introduced to some of the slaves and their perspective and what they've gone through, a few of their personal stories in there as well. We have a little bit of death here and there as well, and there is a few uncomfortable scenes. Admittedly, there's a few moments where there is this posh white male saying, do this to your master or whatever, or do what your master says, or do what your leader says, go and do this, orders here and there, constantly being incredibly strict. And it is rather uncomfortable to listen to, because this is another human telling another human that they are not very important and they are inferior. And I think that this episode, it captures that really well. As I say, it's uncomfortable, but then again, it's meant to be, because I don't think anybody in the right mind would actually find this comforting in any way. I think that this episode captures that incredibly well. Marc Platt has done a really good job for this release. With it being Doctor Who, it respects the fact that it can't go too dark. I would imagine that if this was in the 1 to 50 range, it would have a little bit more of that gruesome side in there, a few more details, a few more gory concepts. However, they've definitely toned it back for this release, but not sort of shied away from the actual truth. And I really do respect Marc Platt for that. I think that it's a daring topic to do. There's a reason we've not really seen it in Doctor Who, and there's probably a reason why we've not seen it in much media, because let's face it, it's a period of human history that we don't really tend to look back on wanting to recreate in media today. And I think that, as I say, I heavily respect Marc Platt for doing something completely different. This episode isn't completely about the slave trade, however. As I previously said, we do have a rhino called Lady Clara that did tour around Europe at that time. And I think that comparison of having the slave trade backed up with the rhino and the story behind that, it is essentially two stories going on at once that then sort of clash together, because at the very beginning we have this idea of a party, a grand ball, feed with by Lady Clara not arriving on time and then being shattered, and then this is then affected by a slave that is on the run but naturally being tracked down, and he goes to find his sister, who just so happens to be working at the same place that the Doctor and his companions have arrived. I think that we do have a lot of different period settings in this one. We get introduced to different places, such as different shops, different villages, and the way that we have sort of the different perspective, as I say, in there as well. We have that standard, more poor, lower class village compared to that of this magnificent ball of higher class people. We have a very good wide range in this one. As I say, the cast do recreate that setting incredibly well by being introduced to people from different classes, and I think that especially with stuff like this, you can't exactly have a whole episode based around the slave trade, and by balancing that out with something about Lady Clara, it really nicely contrasts, because there is a few comical moments in there. I think the fact that we have a rhino that essentially travels on the TARDIS at the very end of the story, Flip essentially has her own part of the story as well when she does technically get kidnapped and is sort of compared to the rhino to an extent. She lives with the rhino in a cage, and they are about to be transported to another country on a boat. And I think that, as I say, that comparison of having Flip doing her own thing and having her own adventure really nicely compares with that of 6th Doctor and Constance Clarke's adventure as well, that is more based around the slave trade. On to one of the main features of this story now, and it is of course the fact that this is a pure historical. Now, for those of you that are not aware of what a pure historical historical is, it's basically an episode of Doctor Who that isn't interfered with by aliens or extraterrestrials, that isn't the Doctor. You sort of forget about the Doctor being an alien in these types of stories. Basically, you have the Doctor landing in a certain period, and the major threat for that episode is the actual period itself and the things that go on within that period, and I absolutely adore those stories. We've seen a lot of that in the earlier half of Doctor Who, especially the first Doctor era. Some of my personal favourite William Hartnell stories, the Reign of Terror, you have the Romans as well. There's quite a lot of stories that do base around that historical feel, the Aztecs as well. And I think that with this story, as I say, it's just nice to have those themes in there. The concept itself also is something that I do really like, and the fact with a pure historical is it doesn't shy away from the fact that humans are the main enemy, the main villain. My gripes for this story is with it being a pure historical, it does follow that format of taking quite a while to start off. I think that at the very end of episode 1, that is where you start to get the premise of, right, this is what's going on, and it is literally in the last few minutes. So you do have probably 20 to 25 minutes worth at the very start of the story that you just need to sort of go through and wait until the things actually kick off. And I'm aware that that is something that does happen quite a lot with the pure historical stories. However, I think that could have been maybe speeded up a little bit more. Some other elements may could have been added in as well in the early half just to make it a little bit more exciting, as we are sort of waiting for a moment. There is this very mysterious part at the beginning where everybody is going, oh, what is Lady Clara? Well, everybody knows, but the Doctor doesn't, and he sort of questions, he makes some jokes and people start laughing because he doesn't understand what Lady Clara is. We all find out that Lady Clara in the end is in fact a rhino as opposed to an actual female, which is what the Doctor was sort of digging at the very beginning. So I think that if you do a little bit of Googling, I think that you can find out that Lady Clara is in fact a rhino, and if you're somebody that goes into this story already knowing that Lady Clara is a rhino, that segment at the very beginning could be a little bit pointless. But for somebody, say, like me, who didn't know who Lady Clara was, it is a rather mysterious segment, but as I say, I think that it still could be toned down a little bit, maybe a few more parts added in, just to make it a little bit more exciting. I would have maybe liked to see a little bit more about Bath in there. The episode is set in Bath in the 1700s, and we do have a little bit more of a sort of wider adventure a little bit later on, but I'm one of those people that would just like to have a little bit more wandering around, seeing a few of the sights, what's going on, what the villages are. We do have a nice segment at the very beginning, literally within probably the first 5 minutes, which shows the Doctor, Flip and Constance going to actual baths, which is a big public baths, of course, which is a very big thing at the time. I wish that we just sort of seen a little bit more of that. Essentially, more tourism, a little bit more of, we're good to this setting, let's go and do this, because I just like that part of Doctor Who. And maybe that's why I like episodes such as Thin Ice quite a lot, because a major part of the first half of that episode was in fact Bill and the Doctor just going around and sort of exploring that period. And maybe this episode could have done with a little bit more of that, or just going into straight away the dark and gritty stuff, because I think that is what this episode is, the main message behind it is, because it is the slave trade, and you can't exactly sort of dodge that in any way. I think those episodes, it has an ending, but it is not the happy ending that you're expecting, which is once again the beauty of a pure historical. The Doctor does as much as he can within the limits, because he can't go as much as he probably would like to and stop the slave trade. He can't free all the slaves, he can't go and blow up all the factories, although he may blow up one in this story, and we have a rather nice moment with him near the very end where he does act rather badass and sort of explodes a massive factory. But yeah, that's fun. But I think that it just has those limitations in there, which is something you do come to expect. However, I still like the way that it's done. I think that introducing certain factories and certain parts in there, and then at the very end we do sort of have your stereotypical pure historical message. So overall for the Behemoth, I think it is a very unusual story. We've tended to have quite a few of these recently where I don't recommend it to absolutely everybody. I think Much Like Time in Office, this is a part of a quite niche area of Doctor Who. If you're somebody that likes pure historicals, which I know that are not everybody's cup of tea, I know that sometimes I've brought them up in the past and how much I would like them to return, and other people have had literally the polar opposite opinion to me, thinking that they should be banished from the show entirely because they are completely boring. And I think that with this episode, I think that if you're somebody, as I say, that does like the pure historicals when it comes to Doctor Who, then this is definitely an episode for you. If you're somebody that likes the slightly more darker and gritty parts of Doctor Who as well, this is also an episode for you. And I think that generally, if you're somebody that does have a passion or interest in history, this may be an interesting concept, because I think with Doctor Who quite a lot, when we have a historical story, it always tends to be Victorian London, which admittedly I absolutely adore Victorian London, but in the new series it tends to have a very Victorian London focused feel, so it would be nice to see more historic settings in the future, especially be it more adventurous, go to different countries, different situations. Much like recently when I reviewed the Plague City, which was set in Edinburgh during the plague, I think that has generally got something to it because it's set in a completely different area that we've virtually never gone into before. And I think that with this one, one, you're going into it to sort of learn as well, learn the situation, learn the different people, how they are affected, and I think especially with this one having the Sixth Doctor plunge into that as well, where he can't necessarily win, and two companions that are from completely different backgrounds. You have Constance Clarke that relates slightly to the people, such as the people that are a part of the slave trade, and absolutely sort of despises the people that are the slave owners, because she feels that they are a little bit like the Nazis, with her being from Bletchley Park within the World War. That is something that she very much does hate. And then Flip has sort of been brought along to the journey as well, who is somebody that has a very modern take on that, is very shocked by society, and then she has quite a nice bond with a rhino as well, which is rather fun. I think that does add a nice comedic part. However, this episode is a learning curve for Flip. I think that she is sort of approached and plunged into a very dark setting, and in a way, we are the companion to an extent, and we are Flip in that situation, being plunged into this story and learning about this rather gruesome and dark part of human history. So as I say, an excellently written story by Marc Platt. There is a few issues and flaws here and there that I have already expressed. However, I think that generally it's a rather deserved list, and I think that if you're to pick up any episodes from this year, this may be one on your list, especially if pure historicals are your thing. That's it for this release. Next up for the Sixth Doctor, Connie and Flip, we return to more a sci-fi focused theme as we take a look at The Middle, written by Chris Chapman. So I guess I'll see you then in that review in November, when it's probably dark and rainy. However, at least it'll be Guy Fawkes night soon. Yay, exciting and wintry. We do love dull winter, don't we? Or at least I do. But yeah, I'm going to go and get more tea now. Thanks for watching this review, and I guess I'll see you all in the next one, whatever that may be. Bye for now.